what I'm going to do, Representative Walsh, is play it without the sound for a second and just have you explain to me what you're doing right here. Because I think you do a show and tell, right? So we might as well just watch that. So give us the rundown.
So I had a meeting yesterday, Tuesday the 19th, with another member of the legislature scheduled. And when we got there, we couldn't get in to the building. And it wasn't a complete surprise. The Speaker of the House in Washington had they basically warned everybody, and the whole her staff. The Speaker of the House, by the way, in Olympia is a woman by the name of Lori Jenkins, who represents a district basically in Tacoma. And she and her staff, and she controls all the staff of the House as Speaker. So the clerk of the House and the legal counsel of the House are all people who work for the Speaker, of course. They had warned members that if we didn't present papers, proof of COVID shots, we would be limited or locked out of our access to buildings. So it wasn't a complete surprise, but we weren't sure exactly how strictly they were going to enforce this policy. And we weren't sure exactly when they were going to start. So we had a meeting scheduled, another member and I, and we went there to go to it, couldn't get in. And so I did a quick live video kind of showing what it looked like. My electronic card key, which all members have in the state legislature, which is this, gets you in everywhere. It's the key. So you can get into the offices, you can get into under the dome, you can get into the Pritchard old library, you can get into all the buildings on the Capitol campus with your card key. Well, my card key and the card key of everybody who didn't present COVID shot papers has been turned off, been deactivated. So we can't get in anywhere. This is a bad thing. It's a bad policy. It basically is the equivalent of a vaccine passport. In other words, you've got to show your papers in order to access your workplace, and I think that's always a bad idea. But beyond that, in this case, it limits the people in my district, my constituents, from having their most effective tool for policy and voicing their opinions and concerns in place at the Capitol. Now, I mean, I can do some of my job, most of my job, like I am right now from home and using technology, and that's fine. But it's not as good as being there. And my constituents are being shut out at least a little bit because I can't get in the buildings.
At the very least, we're paying for an office that's not being used. All right. So
and a chair on the floor of the house.
I want to play the beginning of your video real fast. So let me know if you can't hear him. Here we go.
Sure.
Oh, hang on.
A session, a little bit different this Tuesday. There's something else, a new development here at the Capitol. This is my member identification card that also acts as a key card for access to the Capitol and the office buildings in the Capitol complex campus. This is the John L. O'Brien building, our main House office building adjacent to the Dome, where I do most of my work, where my office is and I do most of my work. Except today, I can't get in the John L. O'Brien building. Normally, my key card will open this door. It doesn't open this door today. What's happened? Well, the House Executive Rules Committee has come up with what they call an interim policy that prevents members from getting in the buildings on the Capitol campus if they don't present
COVID vaccine papers. And I have not presented COVID vaccine papers. So I can't access my office. I can't access the floor, the main chambers over under the dome. I can't do work from the Capitol as a legislator in this state. This is unusual. It is not something that the majority of the members of the legislature have voted on. It's not an emergency proclamation from the governor. It's something different. It is an interim policy made by a small group of legislators and enforced on all legislators here, at least all House members.
Okay, so let's talk about that real fast, because you and I discussed how this is different from Governor Inslee's mandate, but you still blame him, at least for some of it. Why is that?
Yeah, ultimately, the Speaker of the state legislature in Olympia is following the lead of the governor. Now, this particular issue, like I say, is not a governor's proclamation, but in spirit, it follows the emergency proclamations and mandates that Governor Inslee has been making for the past 18 months, going on 2 years. We've talked at length in Olympia about where we are with this stuff. The governor, of course, has emergency powers and considerable emergency powers in this state, and that's by law. That's proper law in Washington. You might not agree with it, but it's good law. And the way it works is the governor can declare a state of emergency in Washington, and he can do that for an unlimited amount of time, or she, of course. The governor can do it for an unlimited amount of time. There's no time limit on that emergency declaration. It can go on as it has for going on 2 years. What happens when a Washington governor declares a state of emergency is it basically unlocks a toolbox of special tools that the governor has. And that includes primarily emergency proclamations. And the law allows the governor to make these emergency proclamations, which are kind of like executive orders, but a little more powerful, a little more urgent. And these emergency proclamations can suspend existing law, or they can not address existing law, but prohibit or require certain activities on the part of the people of Washington. These are powerful tools, and the current governor has used them very aggressively for this period around COVID. And some of his proclamations have suspended or limited existing law, but most of them have been directed at new prohibitions or requirements on the people. What we need as a reform on these emergency powers is time limits, stronger time limits. When a governor declares an emergency in Washington, there should be a time limit, 14 days or 30 days. The number of days we can negotiate, but there needs to be a hard time limit on it. And that would limit the situation we've had in this state for almost 2 years, where the governor is governing like some kind of king, ignoring the legislature, largely ignoring the courts, and making public policy on his whim. And so that's had a corrosive effect on everything in Olympia. And this latest piece from the Speaker of the House really just follows suit in the sort of spirit of the governor's mandates and edicts that he's made under the emergency powers. So yeah, this is not a governor thing directly, this lockout, but it's in the spirit of other actions that the governor has taken. The Speaker's following his lead.
Some of the questions that I've gotten are related to whether, I'll just read them from my locals page. I should give everybody a redirect to, if you all are interested in getting a hold of me or you want to participate outside of a censorship tech company, you go over to locals, aliceamaro.locals.com. It's a great way to post story ideas, help me plan for the week ahead. I have editorial meetings on Saturday mornings, but some of my locals community members were asking about violation of constitutional rights in this regard. Like, one person asked if this could be a violation of the 14th Amendment, equal protection clause, because your citizens are not being represented equally. Or do you feel that the action represents deprivation of rights under color of law, Title 18 U.S. Section 242? I don't know exactly what that is, but I'm just curious, is there any, in your opinion, I guess, because I don't know, would somebody argue, hey, all right, yeah, it's not good, but come on, you can basically do your job from home. So is it really harming your constituents at all? I'm assuming you say yes, but I don't know. What's your answer to that? And then is there any validity to the questions, I guess, about this being some kind of unconstitutional practice?
Well, I mean, my answer is yes. I mean, it doesn't prevent me from doing my job as a representative, but it limits it. It makes it a little harder. It makes my access to the resources in my office there and the human resources and some of the staff that support legislators a little bit harder to do. So it's a hurdle. I mean, it's not a barrier, but it's a hurdle. Makes me a little less effective. As to the questions of constitutionality, I absolutely agree this is unconstitutional, and the governor's actions, which have influenced this action from the speaker, also unconstitutional. Some of the federal constitution sites there aren't going to be controlling, because in most cases the courts will allow the state constitution to preside and kind of determine these things, and that's right. That's the consistent way that courts have approached these issues for many years. The good news there is the Washington State Constitution is even clearer in its equal protection language, equivalent to the 14th Amendment in the federal, than the federal, in my opinion. It's very clear that all rights and privileges, if there are privileges, have to be distributed evenly among all Washington people. So I think that we can make what is essentially a 14th Amendment in the federal Constitution argument, referencing Article 1 of the state Constitution, which contains the analogous protection of rights. So there definitely is a constitutional argument to make there. The Washington State Constitution, as I mentioned, is particularly good on the matter of privileges. It doesn't say that privileges don't exist, but it says that where they exist in any government policy or action, they have to be even to all groups of people. And certainly accessing the Capitol office, I think, would be considered a privilege. And that privilege has to be allocated, allowed by the government, regulated by the government in a way that is even among all people. And in my opinion, that's not happening when some of us are locked out of the offices.
KB asks, did you protest this unsubstantiated emergency proclamation before you got locked out? Has your paycheck stopped? And somebody else asked too, just about, do you feel like lawmakers who may be aligned with you ideologically on this have been assertive enough pushing back?
My paycheck has not stopped, still getting paid. But nobody gets into state legislative work for the money. I mean, yes, I am still being paid, but I'm not paid even as much as some of the first responders and state patrol troopers who have lost their jobs recently. So my financial interest in this is relatively small compared to those people's. They are making a much greater sacrifice. The state legislature in Washington State is still considered legally and technically a part-time job. I've been a critic of the governor's overreach since it started last year. And if you have any questions about that, you can just check out the media coverage. I've been applauded in some circles and ridiculed in others for taking strong stands against the governor's what I consider unconstitutional overreach in the wake of the COVID outbreaks. I authored a bill that was the strictest bill of several that have been filed that would limit emergency proclamations to 14 days in the state of Washington. But I've co-sponsored bills that would limit them to 30 and 45 days. So as I said earlier, I don't mind the number of days, we can negotiate that, but there needs to be a limit in time on these emergency proclamations and the emergency declaration that is kind of the key that unlocks the toolbox of proclamations and other actions. I believe this is an important issue that goes beyond COVID. I believe what's going on now in the state of Washington gets to an essential issue of constitutional separation of powers. This governor is acting in an unconstitutional way, and it's not too much of a stretch to say a tyrannical way. He is not respecting the proper separation of powers among the branches of government. If you remember from your school days, 3 branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. We're supposed to share the responsibilities of making public policy, making law. And this governor is ignoring that separation of powers and that right process completely. And it really breaks my heart and gets to me, Allison, when people say that these edicts and proclamations are law. They are not law. Always keep in mind the hierarchy in public policy. The Constitution is the highest law of the land. And that goes for the state constitution and the federal constitution. The state constitution recognizes the federal constitution as the highest law. But in both cases, kind of on parallel tracks, the Constitution is the highest order of public policy of law. Proper statute, real law, is the second level. In Washington, we call that the Revised Code of Washington, or RCW. And then at the federal level, they call that the United States Code, USC, that one of your viewers referenced. That's law. Everything after statute is not law. And after statute comes administrative code. In Washington, we call the administrative code the WAC, the Washington Administrative Code. In DC, they call it the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulation. Those codes are not law. They are guidelines written by state or federal agencies, bureaucrats, frankly, that are supposed to help implement the law. Administrative code is said to have the power of law. Even that's kind of debatable, but it is definitely not law. And then finally, underneath administrative code, the lowest level of public policy are executive orders and proclamations. And that's what our governor, and to some extent the president recently in DC, have been using to try to make public policy. And they are the lowest and weakest form of public policy. But this governor is happy to have people confuse his edicts and orders as law, and they're not.
You brought up the separation of powers, and I think that is a fair concern that I've heard from people, not just a Washington state local issue, but nationally, when you are starting to see the executive branch and the judicial branch aligning, like, it's obvious, nothing to me has shown more than COVID that laws are really only as good, and the Constitution itself is really only as strong as the courts that will enforce it. And so if you have courts that people don't trust anymore, that seem to be aligned with executive branches, then what kind of recourse do you have? And if you have a lawmaker that can't even get into his own office, then what's the average person's recourse in a situation like this where you want to fight back?
Well, Allison, the average people are the recourse. I mean, the people are the ultimate rulers in our state, in our country, in our system. The Washington State Constitution says it right at the start, Article 1, Section 1. all political power is inherent in the people. The people are much more important than the courts. The people are much more important than the governor, and they're more important than any legislator. The people ultimately will decide what proper public policy is. And for a while, I think the people in Washington were scared. They were afraid. They felt fear about COVID. And they largely, in the early days of the pandemic and the outbreaks, supported the governor's early actions about COVID. As time has gone on and months are going by and soon years will have gone by under this emergency rule by this governor, he's losing the people's support that he had in the early days, and rightly so. The people don't want to be ruled by a king. They don't want to be ruled by a tyrant. The people know that ultimately they are in charge. So it's not the courts we need to save us. It's not legislators that we need to save us. It's certainly not the governor we need to save us. It's the people that we need to save us. And whether that takes the form of resistance and protest, which some people call Irish democracy, whether it takes that or whether it takes voting at the next state level, legislative level voting cycle, which is not this fall, but next fall, I think the people are going to speak and they are going to reform a system that frankly is broken. So I have confidence in the people. The power has always been in the people of the state. Sometimes they forget that and then they remember it. And I think the next year or so, we're going to see people remembering that they're in charge.
All right. I want to ask you this question from Nicholas, which I bet you get a lot on your side where you're working right now on the west side. So get the paperwork out then, or have the jab. As much as it's your right not to have the jab, it's people's rights not to be given a pathogen that kills people. Stop being a snowflake victim. But before I let you answer, that, maybe you're locked out of your office right now and you need a hot cup of coffee. It's raining. It's winter time. You want to support my work while you're doing so. Go to twinenginecoffee.com/Allison, twinenginecoffee.com/Allison. These are high altitude shade grown Nicaraguan but USDA certified organic roasts. I'm a dark roast drinker. They've got a wide variety, though, of different products. And you can even try their Cartura tea right here with the purple box. It's tea you can make out of coffee fruits. I am a huge fan of it. It tastes really good. A lot like tea, but a little bit distinct. However, maybe you need something stronger. So you would like to go to, well, I'm going to have to bring it up separately. Hang on, everybody. You got to go to AllisonWinePromo.com, AllisonWinePromo.com. You get 50% off of some of my favorite Malbecs, my favorite Argentinian Malbecs, and 50% off shipping. There is one Malbec in the pairing here that comes from one of the highest vineyards in the world at 8,950 feet. They use no flavoring, no filtering, no dyes, and no excess chemicals. Again, AllisonWinePromo.com for 50% off of my favorite Argentinian Malbecs and 50% off shipping. Okay, so let's get back to this question. Do you want me to repeat it, or I'll put it back up on the screen? Why are you being a snowflake? This guy asks.
Well, Nicholas, when you have to call people names, you've lost the argument. I will look out for your constitutional rights, Nicholas, even though you're confused and don't understand where they lie in this issue. It's a common thing. You are motivated, I think, by fear, as I mentioned, many people were to start, and try to come to terms with that in your own life. You may find your quality of life improves. What I'm here to do is be a voice for my constituents in Southwest Washington and defend the state's constitution. It is clear that state government exists to protect individual rights. It says so right in the start of the state constitution. And what we have in this abuse of the proper law on emergency actions and continuity of government in the state is an abuse and an attempt to limit the constitutional rights so clearly laid out in Article 1 of the state constitution. As I say, this is an issue far beyond COVID. It's an issue beyond shots versus natural immunity. We can have that conversation. And I think natural immunity has been given the short shrift, has not been paid enough attention to in the COVID policy discussion. But as I say, and I'll keep saying, these issues go beyond COVID. They go beyond shots. They go beyond natural immunity. They get to essential questions of why does the state government exist? And why does the federal government exist? The state government exists to protect people's ability to live life on their terms. The state's constitution is genius in its protection of not only things like the right to keep and bear arms and property rights, very strong on both counts. It's very good on protecting rights, not just to practice religion as you wish, but the state constitution mentions your right of conscience, to live your life according to what your conscience tells you is the right way to live. This is a clearer and more specific constitutional protection even than anything in the federal constitution. And it's that right to conscience, as well as right to privacy, that I think about when I try to work for policy that's better for the people of Washington. And when I oppose the governor's overreach, and when I oppose this latest little overreach and insult from the Speaker of the House, we have to stand for our Constitution. It's the highest law in our land. And the state constitution is the highest law in our state. And those rights to conscience and to privacy, I think they're essential.
All right. We got a super chat here from Allison Smith. Allison, I'm sorry your parents named you Allison with 2 L's. It's okay. You're still welcome here. I work at Boeing. I work at Boeing and might lose my job if they don't accept my exemption, thinking of leaving Washington for Texas. I am curious what you think about people leaving Washington. I don't know if Washington generally is seeing that. Seattle, I feel like, has been hesitant to discuss numbers in versus out. It seems like it's still growing, but it does also, some of the numbers that I have seen show that at least there's more people leaving than there have been in the past. I don't know if sort of the gross number then still is in the increase. We left in 2019 and we got out by the skin of our teeth. I'm happy we live in Eastern Washington now. It's like a totally different state over here. So
Don't
I'm curious.
That, Allison. We want to keep Washington one state. At least I do.
Well, when we were living in Cle Elum, we went into the hardware store, which is, Cle Elum's in the center of the state if people aren't really familiar, but it's just over the mountains on east side of the mountains, which in the mountains is where the divide really is, I think, ideologically. And there was a petition to turn us into Liberty State. So so I guess that's a regular thing over here. But yeah, so curious, another thing I'd like to ask you about, besides just how this affects the demographics of Washington, ideologically, if people leave and what you're hearing from folks, is when it comes to these business exemptions or even state agency exemptions, I'm highly aware of many stories, not just in the news, but people who have told me personally that they are getting their exemption approved, but then they get no accommodation. And then that seems to be how these state agencies especially are getting around this, where it's just like, oh, we're not going to fight you on the exemption because we don't want to get sued, I guess, but we're just going to say we just have no way to accommodate your exemption. And that's how they're getting around it. I'm just curious about your thoughts on that as well.
You're right. There were kind of two parts to the exemption itself, and then the accommodation that would allow a state employee to stay in their job. That is a word game, frankly, that does not absolve the agency of legal liability and any matters of possible wrongful termination or other issues involved there. But it was a word game that the senior bureaucrats at several of the state agencies encouraged and made policy in their organizations. as for private employers, this matter of their enforcing mandates, and in the case of Boeing, I think Boeing is paying more attention to what the president is saying than to what the governor is saying, comes at a heavy price. Essentially, if they agree to enforce these non-lawful, non-law mandates or edicts from executive branch, they are taking on a lot of liability. The liability for wrongful termination claims, the liability for discrimination claims. And frankly, I think any private employer who gets in the business of enforcing these controversial edicts is not making the right decision. They're taking a great amount of risk on and may not realize how much risk they're taking on. We've seen with some private employers in the aerospace or airline industry some backing off harsh demands for COVID mandates. Southwest Airlines, probably highest profile, they've backed off of their initial mandate policy on vaccines and have now taken a much more flexible approach to trying to assure safety and health among their workers. As to Allison with 2L's question, I've gotten quite a few contacts from people at Boeing who are worried about this. And for a long time through this crisis, Boeing took a very measured approach. Just recently, they've started talking about following President Biden's edict, and I think they may yet reconsider what they're saying there. So, Allison, don't despair. Seek your exemption. And talk to your managers and tell them you love your job and you don't want to see this company get political, and they might listen and run that up the pole there. As for people leaving, the significant news lately is Amazon has said that they are no longer committed to downtown Seattle as their headquarters and base of operations. They've had a long process of kind of decentralizing their organizational structure, but their current CEO has made it pretty clear they're looking to move across Lake Washington into Bellevue and other places east, their future, headquarters and workspace development. As for Boeing, they're probably example one of leaving the state. Their corporate headquarters is now in Illinois, and most of their operational development lately has been in South Carolina. So, Allison from Boeing, you may not want to go to Texas. You may want to go to South Carolina. You might be able to stay with your same firm. We're deeply concerned in Olympia about Boeing moving all of its remaining operations out of Washington. And this is certainly a real risk. If they enforce the president's version of mandates and get slapped with a bunch of huge lawsuits about doing it, I'm worried that might hasten their exit from Washington state. So we will do what we can, again, without offering special privileges. We will do what we can to keep Boeing and certainly Amazon here in Washington.
Okay, I have a couple more questions before we wrap. Back to your point about the risk that these companies could be taking on legally. If you're a private company and you got to pay your lawyers' fees, then I think that's a fair point to make. However, as a journalist who used to work in Seattle, I covered the environment, which was a very litigious sector of journalism to cover. It was very clear that government agencies may not have the same level of sort of risk versus reward considerations that a private company would, because we pay their legal fees. We are paying for the government's lawyers, and then we're paying for our own. And so it can be very difficult to go up against the government. And so with all these lawsuits being filed against government agencies, and then also courts that seem to be aligned with supporting them, it seems like it seems like a very defeatist position to be in. I know there are a lot of people doing it, but I've always questioned whether fighting the government just ends up running out your pocketbook while people just in the government run out your time. They run out the clock and your wallet, and what are you left with at the end? I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, it's absolutely true. The Department of Ecology in Washington has killed several industrial development projects in my district, and in generally in Southwest Washington, with exactly that, with running out the clock by running up legal processes in really illegal and unconstitutional and unethical ways, requiring not just one, but multiple environmental impact studies that just drag out time and expense to people who want to build, factories and facilities and port terminals. And they do it cynically. They do it to bankrupt companies that are interested in developing business in Washington. So you're absolutely right. That happens. But I think we're at the point, Allison, where we may be at an inflection point where the people and the business community in Washington has had enough of capitulating to radicals of various sorts, whether environmental or social justice or just big government tax and spend tyrants. They've had enough. And I think they're going to start pushing back. I think we'll see some of that this fall right now in some of the local elections taking place around the state. Watch the school board elections happening all around Washington right now. That may be the beginning of a wave of this inflection where I think people will get more active and start pushing back against radicalism. And you may see it build in 2022, next year, when there are legislative races in Washington. And I hope you see it peak in 2024, the next time there are the big statewide races in Washington, governor, state attorney general, commissioner of public lands, and the rest.
Okay, I think this is my last question, unless you have anything else you want to add. We're seeing a lot of the people who have lost their jobs go on social media and talk about it. I just did a video yesterday about journalists who are doing that, which is really new. I have never seen so many journalists dog their corporate employers for their decision making publicly. But so say you're somebody, though, you're still employed, you're talking like aligned with what you're saying, you want to push back, but you go on social media and do it. Now, this has always been this has been a controversial topic for many years, right? Whether a private company has the right to get rid of you because, hey, it's a private company. They're not restricted necessarily by the First Amendment. Say you work for the state, okay? You're somebody who's works for Washington State, and you've decided, this is wrong. I'm not going to wait till I get fired. I'm going to go on and I'm going to talk about how I want to stick up for my coworkers, and I don't think this is right. And it's your personal time, your personal business. I guess I get a lot of questions from people about wanting to join, at least, like, if that's all you have, that's the only voice you have, is you're going to go on and just say, I just stand against this, but you're afraid you're going to lose your job. You work for the state. I'm just curious what you think about the protections there. Like, does the state have the right to say, no, you can't, you can't speak out. This is our policy. You work for us. You got to be aligned with it. Because again, like I said, for the people who are already out, I don't know if it really matters that much, right? They've already lost their job, but there are people who are still there. They'd like to change the system. Maybe they want to push back on what's happening. They're able to still be there and say something. What about fears of retaliation when it comes to free speech?
A lot to unpack there. Free speech is a constitutionally protected right. And private firms, separate of state agencies, do have a right of free speech and association of their own. So in the case of a private employer, it's a conflict of constitutional protections: the person's right to speak their mind and the company's right to hire and fire who it will, in most cases, unless there's a contract or collective bargaining agreement. So there, it's an individual's ability to speak up is probably a more of a judgment call of the individual, whether they want to want to stay part of a culture and a job that they're critical of. In the case of the state, I think that it's an interesting dynamic. Same dynamic applies some, but the individual's rights probably a little stronger if they're a government employee, since the right of free speech and association applies to individuals and companies, but not to the state government. Again, it's a question, Allison, not so much of your right. You have a right to spout off on social media, whatever you want. It's a question subordinate to that right is, what do you want your work atmosphere to be? I mean, workplaces are cultures, and do you want to go along with that culture? Do you want to shake up that culture? If you want to shake up that culture, there may be difficulties involved in shaking up a culture, and you need to be kind of philosophical about that and understand if you shake up a culture, it may not like being shaken. I know that there are a lot of state workers. The Department of Corrections comes to mind, where they did end up getting the COVID shots against their inclinations, against their, I don't want to say against their will, but against what their preference would have been. And those workers, those state employees are kind of angry about it. And my advice to them has been, channel your anger into reforming your department. And, channel your anger into voting and talking your family members and friends and people into voting. So I think that will be a factor in the couple of years ahead, Allison. I think there are going to be state employees who ended up taking the COVID shots and aren't happy about it, but they wanted to keep their jobs. And I think those people will become an influence in their agencies and in the general public and general voting trends.
It's funny that you say that, because this came in at the same time. If you don't live in one of the 4 counties on the west side, your vote doesn't count in Washington.
That's not true. The trouble the east side of the state has had is that it has relatively low voter turnout to the west side. If voters on the east side of Washington and central Washington had turned out in stronger numbers, Rob McKenna would have been elected governor a couple of cycles ago, and Jay Inslee never would have gotten into the office. But the voter turnout on the east side was lower than the west side, and so the outcome was what we got. We need to work on voter turnout, and voter turnout in all parts of the state, but particularly in eastern Washington, needs to be higher.
They followed up with, if states use the Electoral College at a state level for elections, this state and many others would look a lot different.
I've run that bill a couple of times. It needs to be narrowly focused. Some of the very early efforts before I got in the legislature were too broad. They wanted an electoral college for all elected offices. Using the federal system as the guide, we need to focus it only on the governor's race. And even then, we need to structure a state electoral system very carefully to be constitutionally compliant. There's a path to do it, but it would only be for the governor's race. And frankly, we need a governor in office who'll sign that bill if it gets through the legislature. And you would need a very reform-minded governor, which we do not have right now in Washington, to be willing to sign that bill into law.
Okay. Anything else that you would like to add before we go, Representative Walsh? I appreciate your taking all the time for this.
Yeah, good questions. The
Oh,
Constitution is the highest law of the land. I believe constitutional rights will prevail in the end. The Constitution is stronger than fear. And ultimately, that's what it's going to come down to. I'm looking forward to the next couple of election cycles here in Washington.
there was one other question that came in. It's kind of what I asked before, but maybe this is more direct. So can a state employer tell you that if you don't censor your social media, your job is at stake?
Kind of unresolved. The tendency is no, but there have been some situations where when the the social media presence was particularly aggressive or particularly, did not conform with local standards of decency, then the state agency can say something like that. But it's very much an unresolved question that, since social media issues are still relatively new, the courts haven't really chewed all the way through. As I've said before, my tendency would be to think that First Amendment rights must be protected, but decency and maintaining a safe and equitable workplace are interests that the state has. So it's a balance of interest, and the courts are going to have to rule.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, with everybody, everybody going to social media, I can't keep up with all of the social media posts. It's like at first I'm like, oh, I got to find that person. I got to find that person. Now there's so many people posting about stories. I could just do one of these a day for years. Okay, I did get one last question. Sorry, I wanted to ask this too from locals. Do you think the speaker is primarily concerned with COVID transmission, or is this about something else, like sending a message?
Good question. I know that the speaker is what I would call a true believer about COVID risk. She believes that COVID is an imminent and deadly risk to millions of people. I think that's a bit of an overstatement of the risk, but I believe in her heart that's what she believes. I guess what I would say to your question is both could be happening simultaneously. I mean, there may be a true believer element in her actions, as well as a control kind of political element too. I think it's primarily the first, but I think there may be a little bit of the second in it.
Okay. All right, everybody. Well, thanks for watching. Representative Walsh, thanks again for taking the time. I guess we'll keep watching to see when you get let back into your office.
We're gonna work on it from several angles, the bully pulpit, as well as legal tools and every other thing we've got.
We'll definitely, I'm sure there will be many, many more interesting stories to come out of this. All right. Thanks again.